everyone, last week I ranked the 4 trilogies inside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and today we're going to rank the 3 trilogies inside of the X-Men franchise. Instead of using my usual worst to best methodology, today we're doing this showdown style. We're going to have 5 rounds of competition, and at the end of this we are going to determine the ultimate trilogy inside of the X-Men franchise. Now, to be clear, a trilogy is a set of 3 movies. There have to be 3 movies for it to be a trilogy, therefore Deadpool is not a trilogy. So here's what the 5 rounds are. Round 1, we're going to look at the Rotten Tomatoes score. Round 2, we're going to look at the first movie. Round 3, we're going to look at the second movie. Round 4, we're going to look at the third movie. And in our 5th round, we are going to look at the consistency overall of the franchise. If we have a tie at the end of this, the tiebreaker will be a poll that I put up on my YouTube page where you guys voted for what is the best trilogy inside of the X-Men universe. Now, before I get started, go and tell me down below in the comment section, how do you rank the trilogies inside of the X-Men franchise? I'd love to get your take on it. Tell me the best, tell me the worst, and tell me why, because why is a lot more interesting than what number you put next to the different movies. With that said, let's get started. In round number 1, we are looking at the Rotten Tomatoes scores of the movies inside of each of these franchises. In last place is going to be the Wolverine trilogy with an average Rotten Tomatoes score of 67%. X-Men Origins Wolverine only had 37% on Rotten Tomatoes. The Wolverine was quite a bit better with 69%. And then the highest scored movie of the entire X-Men franchise is Logan with 93%. So the Wolverine franchise has both the lowest scoring movie as well as the highest scoring movie inside of the X-Men franchise. Now here's where things get really interesting. Both the original X-Men trilogy and the First Class trilogy have the exact same average Rotten Tomato score with 74.67%. Looking at the original X-Men trilogy, the first movie had 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. The second movie jumped up just a little bit to 85%, and then a big dip down to 58% for X-Men 3: The Last Stand. Looking at the First Class movies, the first movie is at 86%, and then the second movie, Days of Future Past, is at 90%. Once again, a step up for that second movie, but another huge drop off for the third movie. Apocalypse is only at 48%. If you average both of those trilogies, they end up at 74.67%. So at the end of round number 1, in last place is the Wolverine trilogy with 3 points, and then tied for first place is the original X-Men trilogy as well as First Class with 1 point. The way the scoring is done is basically you get a number of points equal to your rank on that round. So Wolverine was ranked 3rd, so they get 3 points, and then the other 2 were in first place, so they each received 1 point. In round number 2, we are looking at the first movie in each of the trilogies. Now, as I talk about these movies, there might be some slight variation from my previous ranking of the X-Men franchise, as I'm looking at the movies specifically as a franchise in and of itself and how the movies kind of tie together a little bit, so there could be a bit of variation. Coming in last place is going to be X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now, this is a movie that in general just doesn't really work for me. There's kind of some tone issues with it going from melodrama and being this big epic story spanning 100 years, and then it kind of shifts into cartoon mode at certain times with like the Blob and Gambit, and then there's slapstick humor with Wolverine and goofing around with his claws in a bathroom at one point in time, where certain elements just don't really work. But as a movie inside of the greater X-Men franchise, and specifically the Wolverine trilogy, it doesn't really set up the pieces right, because it retcons details we learned from other X-Men movies, but it doesn't set up where we're going with the Wolverine movies at all. There's an enormous time spent with this romance that doesn't really go anywhere in the story of Logan. It only affects this specific movie. It just kind of feels like a standalone movie that's not particularly good and definitely doesn't set up anything for the rest of the trilogy. In second place is the original X-Men. Now, there's a huge jump in quality, if you ask me, jumping up to this movie. There's a lot of things I love about this movie. It sets up the X-Men universe very well as the themes that run throughout all of the original X-Men trilogy. Whether you're talking about Logan as he starts to journey into being a hero, not just an anti-hero, whether you're talking about Rogue and her desire to not be a mutant and not desire to have those abilities, the relationship between Charles Xavier and Magneto, all of that is set up in this movie really nicely, so it kicks off the franchise very well. Where the movie runs into problems is the specific story itself involving Magneto trying to kidnap Rogue so he can turn politicians into mutants. It just isn't particularly compelling and just feels a little bit tacked on, but it really is a great kickoff to the franchise because of the world building and the vibrant characters we're introduced to. But in first place is going to be X-Men First Class. This is one of the most stylized movies inside of the entire X-Men franchise, where it kind of has this 60s James Bond vibe to the production design and the way things are kind of shot in the mix. But the real standout here is the relationship between Charles Xavier and Magneto that runs throughout this entire trilogy, as we see their shared values in this first movie, and as the movies go along, you see them diverge and go in different directions. This movie establishes who they are and why they go in the different directions throughout this entire franchise. In and of itself, it tells a really good story. I really enjoy Kevin Bacon as the villain here. You understand what's kind of going on in the collecting of the First Class itself. Some of them can be a little bit dull and forgettable, but the movie as a whole is not forgettable at all. It is quite exciting and kicks off a great trilogy. At the end of round 2, Wolverine is in last place with 6 points. In second place is X-Men with 3 points, and in first place is First Class with only 2 points. From there, we're going to go into round 3, where we're talking about the second movie in each of these trilogies. Once again, in last place, unfortunately, is The Wolverine. Now, this is a movie that's quite a bit better than X-Men Origins Wolverine, has a very distinct vibe to it. James Mangold managed to find a way to bring kind of a Western vibe to his Wolverine movies, and you see that here as Wolverine's kind of wandering a little bit lost in life after the events of X-Men The Last Stand, and you find him in a place of strong reflection. And this movie very much is a drastic change of direction from the first movie and kind of picks up nicely with James Mangold's 2 movies, have some similar themes driven throughout them, and you can tell that they were made by the same director. There's some amazing action sequences in here as you get to see Wolverine fight ninjas on trains, and Hugh Jackman is absolutely up for the part in this movie. Unfortunately, the story itself and the side characters don't match the quality of the visceral action and the deep emotions that James Mangold's able to run throughout the core of his movies. So the end result is a good movie, but not necessarily a great movie. In second place is Days of Future Past. This is a great sequel to X-Men First Class, as it takes the themes and where that movie left off and explores where would this take the characters going into the next movie. And the big thing that happens is Charles Xavier at the end of X-Men First Class, if you haven't seen it, spoiler, but he loses the ability to walk because he gets shot, and this takes him to a place of hopelessness and despair where he has to make kind of harsh, hard choices in life. But of course, that's just one of many plot lines running throughout this movie, as it's a time travel story about a post-apocalyptic future and our original X-Men characters having to go back in time to try and resolve things. So this is one of the biggest movies in the entire X-Men franchise and brings all these characters together in a way that works really nicely. I also love that they did a big time jump from the movie X-Men First Class that allows us to see the characters in a very different place and see their stories just kind of fork off and go in very different directions. This is a very cool way to do a sequel to a movie. But there is a second movie in one of these trilogies that I think is even just a little bit better. And in first place is going to be X2, X-Men United. This movie takes all the themes established in the first movie about racism, about family and their rejection, about the interesting complex dynamic between Magneto, his brotherhood, and the X-Men, and it takes all of it to the next level. And it explores this idea that there's people out there that are far worse than Magneto and his kind of evil schemes. And this is what makes the movie just one of the great sequels of all time. Since the previous movie was able to lay the foundation, it gives this movie the opportunity to tell a far more complex story where you get to add new characters like Nightcrawler, you got Magneto in prison, you have the evil government agencies going on and their controlling of mutants, and then you have the X-Men on the run. All of this makes for a very compelling story that takes everything to the next level. Character development, the action, and then as you move into that third act and there's true sacrifices that take place, there's legitimate emotional satisfaction as the movie comes to a close. This is a great movie. So at the end of round 3, Wolverine remains in last place with 9 points, but tied for first place is the original X-Men Trilogy and then the First Class Trilogy. Moving into round 4, we are talking about the third movie in each of these franchises. In last place is going to be X-Men: The Last Stand. Now this is a movie that in a lot of ways on paper looks like a great into this trilogy, a great continuation of the previous movie. You add Dark Phoenix in the mix, which is a nice extension of what they did with Jean Grey at the end of X-Men 2. There's this exploration of the Cure, which ties nicely into many of the themes that are running throughout the entire franchise, specifically with Rogue's storyline. And then you get the culmination of Magneto's Brotherhood kind of trying to battle the world. But when you bring all those storylines together, it just doesn't work. There was kind of several last-minute director dropouts on this one. Bryan Singer didn't return. Matthew Vaughn dropped out fairly late in production, and they just had to bring Brett Ratner in just to kind of make the movie. And they kind of have some serious problems in the storytelling because of that. Cyclops dies and it's just kind of shrugged off in the movie. You also have Charles Xavier dies and it has some emotional weight, but not nearly as much as it should. And the whole thing just kind of feels flat as things happen and you go, this should be huge. This should be an amazing storyline. And it just, none of it works the way it should. So this movie, unfortunately, comes in last place. In second place is X-Men Apocalypse. This is another movie based off some great X-Men source material. Apocalypse is one of the great X-Men villains, and the inherent nature of both his name and the character himself means you're doing epic storytelling. Unfortunately, here the storytelling falls flat. It's big, it has end-of-the-world type stakes at hand, but none of it works as well as it should. And a lot of that goes back to the Apocalypse character himself, whose characterization feels very flat. From the way he's visualized, he just doesn't look quite right. He's not big enough, he's not tall enough. The way he's even used in the third act, they chose a very odd direction to visualize him as a main villain battling the X-Men. But then even his scheme just feels very one note. You don't feel there's a depth to him that you can on any way kind of care about what he's doing. He's just a bad guy. And unfortunately, that undermines some of the elements of this movie that are quite good. In particular, the stuff about Magneto and his family and everything that happens with that, I think is excellent. It's some of the best stuff in all of the X-Men movies. Unfortunately, the rest of the movie doesn't live up to those Magneto aspects of the first half of the movie. So this one comes in second place and is the weakest of the X-Men First Class trilogy. But in first place on this one, easily, is Logan. This is a movie that is a special type of comic book movie because you couldn't do this movie 15 years ago. Part of what makes it work is we've spent so much time with Hugh Jackman as Logan and with Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier. We know these characters, and now this movie gets to explore people at the end of their life, reflecting on the mistakes that they've made. And it's a movie that's actually about death. It has the action of a comic book movie. It's got the excitement, but it's a movie with deep, rich themes, exploring ideas. This movie takes some actors that have given many great performances inside the X-Men franchise and takes it to that next level. It's also a great follow-up to where we saw Logan in the Wolverine as he was lost in that film, and this just kind of extends that to the next level as he's looking around at life and wondering, what do I do now? Kind of wanting to die, knowing he's going to die. This makes for a unique and highly emotionally resonant cinematic experience that brings this trilogy that's had some shaky spots to a very satisfying conclusion. After round number 4, the Wolverine is still in last place with 10 points. In second place is the X-Men Trilogy with 7 points, and currently in first place is X-Men First Class with 6 points. In round number 5, we are looking at the consistency of the trilogies. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the consistency of the quality, but do the themes and storylines flow from one movie to the next, or do they feel like standalone movies that are just tied together by the lead characters? In last place on this one is going to be the Wolverine trilogy. As I discussed before, the first Wolverine movie very much feels like a standalone movie. It has a distinct tone, it tells a story that stands within itself, that doesn't really set up any themes or directions where things go with the rest of the movies. The movie's all about Sabretooth and this love story, and none of that has anything to do with the other two movies in the franchise. With that said, the two James Mangold films do feel like they go together pretty well. It's not an excellent connection, but you can definitely feel that the same person made each one of these movies. There's some themes and kind of this Western feel to them that ties them together. But when compared to the other two trilogies inside the X-Men franchise, easily this is the least consistent. Coming in second place is the X-Men First Class trilogy. Now, there's a lot of things about these movies that do tie together pretty nicely, mainly that the three movies are about this trio of characters, Eric, Charles, and Raven. We get to see kind of the direction that they go throughout each of these films on their journey together. The problem is that it kind of goes off in some different directions as you go into Days of Future Past. Because they bring the other X-Men trilogy into the mix, it kind of feels a little bit more like a team-up movie of the generations, more so than just a first-class sequel. So that's a little bit of a problem. But even more so as you go into Apocalypse, the characters don't seem to, the movie isn't really about that trio and where they land and end up. In particular, Magneto, you get some, as I said, you get some great things at the beginning of the movie, but it takes him on a journey where it seems like he's fairly marginalized in the second half of the movie. Now he's standing there making clouds of garbage in the sky, but he's a side character to Apocalypse. We're not really seeing his journey so much. And so that doesn't feel like a continuation and conclusion to what we started in X-Men First Class. Likewise, making Raven and Mystique the leader of the X-Men sort of in the movie doesn't feel like the right continuation of what has happened in the previous two movies. So there's several things that make it feel a little bit off, where the story and themes aren't really being brought to culmination by the end of the third movie. But in first place is going to be the original X-Men trilogy. As many issues as I have with X-Men The Last Stand, it does do a pretty nice job of closing out the storylines that were started in the original X-Men movie. Whether you're talking about the love triangle between Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops, we get an answer to that love triangle. We see where that plays out. Whether you're talking about Rogue and her issues being a mutant, it gives resolution to that storyline. Likewise with Magneto and Charles Xavier and their storyline and their rivalry, it comes to culmination. We get a resolution to that conflict in this movie. So easily, the original X-Men trilogy, in my mind, is the closest to a proper trilogy inside the X-Men franchise, as it tells three distinct stories that also have storylines that tie throughout all of them. And so if you put them all together, it tells the beginning, the middle, and the end of a storyline in and of itself. So for me, this is the most consistent of the X-Men trilogies. After round number 5, our final score is the Wolverine in last place with 13 points. But once again, we have a tie between First Class and the original X-Men trilogy with 8 points. That means we're going to have to go over to our poll to decide who wins. I asked, what is the best X-Men film trilogy? In last place, you guys said the original X-Men trilogy with just 17%. In second place, you said X-Men First Class with 31%. But you guys said that the Wolverine trilogy was the best with 52% of the votes. And at the time I pulled this data, 19,000 people had voted. So based on your tie-breaking decision, if you look at the final points, in last place still is Wolverine with 14 points. In second place is the original X-Men trilogy with 11 points. But in first place is X-Men First Class. For me, I would say that the original X-Men trilogy is the best trilogy in the X-Men universe. That would be my personal opinion, but you guys decided with your final votes on this one and putting First Class at the top. With that said, go ahead and tell me down below in the comment section, how do you rank the trilogies inside of the X-Men universe? Don't just kind of give me a number, kind of tell us why. What do you love? What do you hate? What's the best movie? What's the worst movie? All that fun stuff that shapes your opinion, because the why is a lot more interesting than what number you put next to them. And if you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, TV reviews, ranking videos, but the key thing is I don't want to just talk about movies, I want to talk about movies with you. So please join me down in the comment section. Let's have a lively yet respectful conversation about these X-Men trilogies. And as always, thank you for watching.